Okay, but finally, because we were unable to get enough speakers, we had this ridiculous idea to have a panel discussion. Yeah, so it's just the two of us because it's always the two of us, but we also got like two of our local rockstar developers, Aysha and Zell. So if you all don't know them, I mean, come on, how can you not heard of them? Yeah, like, basically both of them spoke at CSS Conf Asia earlier last year, and both are really, really talented developers and probably have a lot of opinions about our panel discussion topic. Okay.
What we're talking about tonight is, we said we're going to talk about CSS frameworks, but then we all said we hate CSS frameworks, so we decided not to talk about them. Instead, we're going to talk about CSS naming conventions. CSS gets complicated quickly, as I'm sure all of you know. So a good naming structure makes a big difference, and there are lots of different patterns out there. The lazy pattern is this one, copying and pasting from Stack Overflow. But sooner or later you'll think that maybe we should have something else. And this is, I've not had very much sleep and I can't remember who wrote this. The question is whether you should actually have any structure behind your CSS at all. From a performance standpoint, it doesn't really make any difference. There was a big push a few years ago saying that you need to optimize your CSS selectors and things like that. Then the browser vendors, every single one of them, one after another, said, nah, don't bother. It can make a difference if you're loading too much CSS, but that usually means you're doing something else wrong. But you don't want to repeat everything every time you start a new project. And you do ideally want to be able to learn from what other people are doing. So the idea of having some kind of structure behind what you're doing is really significant. So I've just summarised some of the options that are out there, but I'm sure there are more. There's the W3C, don't use any standard whatsoever. Basically, you have the HTML elements which you can describe, you can add a class here or there. This will work for the most part, but you may not want to. Nicole Sullivan's object-oriented CSS. This is probably the first proper attempt at documenting a better way of doing things. Her way of doing it is basically to have descriptive classes, so it's more or less of what people had already been doing, but just with a couple of rules in place, like not using IDs because they're a little bit too powerful, and avoiding location-specific styles. So it's not too specific to where the layout's going to be. Just a really quick example, looking at the code. The class that's on this thing is leftcol and myYahoo. They don't really tell you anything about it, but it's enough just to style it. It's not too verbose. Pretty straightforward. Then came Atomic CSS.
Wow, this one. Is the one.
This is a painful one. Even more people than CSS.
Atomic CSS is somewhat controversial. I would like to print out their code and burn it. That's how much I like it. The idea behind Atomic CSS is to break the styling elements down to the most basic level. I think of it as CSS for sadists, but let the code speak for itself. This is just inspecting this one element, and it's not that these class names are really long. Most of these classes are only a few characters each, but it's just crazy pants. You may like this, which is fine for you. Don't ever work for me or with me.
It looks like an April Fool's joke. Right?
Oh yeah. Basically, instead of giving a class name, you give every descriptive attribute. The advantage of doing this is that your CSS is probably down to about 3 lines because you just don't need to declare all that much. Your HTML is out to 3,000. Scalable Modular Architecture for CSS by Jonathan Snook, SMACS. This was probably the first real attempt at trying to provide a structure beyond just the naming of things. So what directory you might break your CS up into. maybe you have one big CSS file, maybe you have several. Jonathan's idea is to actually break things up, so you've got a bit more structure behind what's going on. His CSS per se isn't that much different from what you'll see out there. Here we have a button that's got a class of BTN. Wow, groundbreaking. Pretty much to the point. He's said that he's not too strict on naming structures per se. And if anything, he leans towards BEM, but does it his own way. This is developed by Yandex. They're basically like a Russian version of Google. Currently taking to the courts to try to beat Google because Google are winning. So this is their own in-house thing. This is probably a little bit controversial as well because it can lead to crazy long class names. The basic idea is you have a block element modifier. Your block is some kind of scope. The element is the thing that you want to actually style. And for the most part, you'll only have block elements. And then you'll have a modifier, so it might be an active state, a different version of a button or something along those lines. Inspecting the button, this one's pretty straightforward. It's a button with text in it. Then going into science fiction land, CSS modules strictly aren't within the realm of what we're talking about, yet they absolutely are. Mostly because it's controlled, like you write your CSS, but there's code that manipulates the CSS on the way to the browser and gives you localized scoping which otherwise doesn't exist within CSS until a recent spec. The idea behind this is each separate part of your code remains absolutely discrete from every other part, and that means that you can chop and change certain elements of your code with no fear of what anyone else is going to do. That's pretty awesome. You can achieve similar effects with BEM if you write it properly. That's the idea behind that, but this is taking it to a different level. So that's basically what's out there at the moment. Camera does to us. I love camera. Right, now I've got a proper panel. All those people who are sitting close to the screen lose. Zell, what do you do?
Okay, so I use a combination of BEM and SMAX and maybe some old CSS. And I also use a method of namespacing my components. If you have read Harry Roberts on namespacing components, he kind of says that you can split things up into objects or components, layouts. It's kind of similar to SMAX in a way. So I use that kind of methodology. So what happens is that I might have a button. According to Harry Roberts, it's like objects are slightly different from components in a way that objects can be used in many different places within components itself. So let's say, for example, a button will be an object in this case. So because buttons can be found in multiple components. The reason why we want to split components and objects apart is that components usually have component-related styles, while objects can be littered all around your website and they should behave the same way. Then what happens is that if someone else comes in and maintain your code, you kind of, hey, object I probably not touch because this will spoil something else somewhere which I don't know. But if you do a component, then the component styles are localized to that component and then you can change that. Yeah, so what Harry says is that you use O as the object and then a C dash as component, L dash as a layout, something like that. So because I realized that I write objects and components so often, I basically do nothing with objects. So I write BTN as BTN. If I have a component, say article, usually I don't style the element itself, I style it as a class. So I will have a capital A article. So capital first letter will be a component for me. It's like a sort of hack, so you can take a look at the CSS and know quickly that, hey, this is the object, this is the component, or something like that. And recently I wrote a blog post on moving from Bootstrap to Suzy, which is how I write my grids nowadays. So I have a .l meaning layout, and all my grids will have only one class. All the items inside the grid will be div without classes. Then I style it with my CSS. interesting.
Sounds scary.
No, it's not really scary. So what you do, let's say for example you have a 3-column grid, then .L-G or .L-G3, meaning 3 columns. Then inside the CSS we'll play with nchild. Then you don't have to like the good thing about that convention is that you don't have to name the classes within your container class. And naming the classes within a container class can get somewhat irritating sometimes because let's say for example you have a content sidebar, dot content sidebar container dot content dot sidebar, but what if you have something else that's way out of the grid thing? And then you have to start thinking about grid and then you start mixing around with semantic names and non-semantic names and everything goes haywire.
So you've basically got a pseudo-scoped CSS by using the block in that sense.
Yeah.
So in theory, when we actually end up with native CSS scope, that will save a lot of trouble. I mean, in practice, that will save a lot of trouble.
Which one?
When we have native scope within CSS. So at the moment, everything in CSS is global.
I don't think having the local scope in CSS is that much of a problem personally, because I'm so, maybe that's just me, but I'm so used to writing components, objects, and layouts and naming my things correctly such that nothing overrides anything.
Okay, Aysha.
So I know that we have a lot of naming conventions out there, like you mentioned. We have them, CSS and SMAX, and of course CSS. And I'm in the opinion that it doesn't really matter which
When you
one.
mentioned atomic, it was like
Yes. So I feel like it doesn't really matter which naming convention that you use. What is actually important is to pick the right one with your team members and actually stick with it. And I think sticking with it is the hardest part, because think about like when you are sticking with a particular naming convention, you need to make sure that your team members are following the rules in a way, and no one likes to follow rules. And then you need to think about onboarding new members as well. So at Wiki, I can't even actually pinpoint a particular naming conventions that we are actually following, because it's definitely different from, it's definitely not under the SMAX, CSS, or definitely not atomic CSS umbrella. So what we use is basically we sort of create our own. And if I have to describe it, I would say it's similar to the Bootstrap naming convention. So, but like, for example, we do share one particular similar principle with CSS, and that is to separate it's a separation of concern basically. And CSS, one of the main principles of CSS actually to separate skin from structure. What do you mean by that? Say for example, you have a button, a group of buttons that you have to style. And so these buttons may have similar structure, right? They have similar width, similar height, similar padding. So what you would do is you have a class called button, and you will put all of the properties like width, height, and paddings in one class, while you abstract out the skin, basically the look and feel of the buttons in different class, like button primary or button secondary. Basically the rules is you shouldn't actually mix skin properties like background color, font size, and text color in one in a similar rule as say structure-based properties like width, height, and paddings. So I think this is really useful because it actually does make your CSS more reusable. And I think when you think about picking a convention, right, there's 3 goals that you actually need to think about. And these 3 goals are ensuring that your CSS is consistent, maintainable, and also reusable. So I've spoken about the reusable part. Now I would like to speak about the maintainable part, or more like the consistent part actually. So actually this is a tip given to me by Chris during CSSConf. He actually suggested me to use a tool called CSS Lint, and it does make my CSS more consistent because I can actually enforce rules, certain rules. So for example, one of the problems before CSS Lint that I noticed is, I work with a lot of developers, so different developers have different ways in writing their CSS. Some are very advanced, they know their CSS very well. Some are very novice. They don't have much knowledge in terms of how to write scalable CSS. So when I'm talking about novice developers, they start to nest their CSS, their SCSS, when they're writing their SCSS, they start to nest like 4 or 5 levels. And this is not really good. It's not really consistent or maintainable, because if you think about overriding that CSS, you actually have to write more levels, and it's not going to make it more consistent. So as CSS Lin, with SCSS Lin, you can actually enforce certain rules on, how many levels should you nest, for example, and definitely makes your CSS more consistent and therefore more predictable. And the third part I want to talk about is the maintainable part, which I think we're still working on, Vicky. So I think what's important is to actually just think about classes as a style. So one of the problems that I encountered recently was when I was refactoring a piece of code. And I noticed that I made a mistake because there are problems where I'm using CSS as style and I'm using CSS as a JS hook. So when I'm removing one class, the feature was not working well anymore. And I was like, oh, why is it not working? I didn't notice. So this is when you start to think about, where you need to start thinking about how to make your CSS, your code base, basically more maintainable, is to start thinking about how to structure that, right? So my suggestion is either to use data attributes as a selector, or maybe prefix this JS hook class as maybe a JS abbreviation in front of these classes. So you understand clearly which one is class for stylings and which one is for JavaScript hooks. So that's all. These are the 3 main points that I really want to put forth today. So I think that basically it doesn't really matter which one you go for. You can even create your own. It's just to make sure that you stick with it and make sure that it's consistent, maintainable, and reusable. Yeah, that's all I know.
Yeah. So my experience is more similar to Aysha, because both of us work and for large projects. The Wiki is quite a big project. I used to work for an agency, so we did land a rather major rework, and that experience was basically it encapsulated all the challenges that both of them talked about. So what happened was the problem with that particular project was that we were building it as the design was coming up. So it was a lot more challenging to sort of think about this sort of CSS architecture, because you don't know what's coming next. So I follow I think because Zell and I both follow the same people in terms of like CSS and general web development. So Harry Roberts is a guy that I refer to a lot as well. So my naming convention is very similar to his. So I do have the object and the component method of doing things. Recently, I keep encountering a lot of articles that talk about functional CSS or expressive CSS. Basically, it's the bootstrap style, whereby your class just, for example, there's going to be a class called block. There'll be a class called underline. So that concept is that you're actually building CSS Lego blocks that you. So essentially, what that premise would be that when you build your website, you practically the amount of CSS that you have to write from scratch will be minimal, because the classes are already there. You've already pre-written all the CSS, and then you just have to combine all these different classes together. I mean, on paper it sounded good to me, but when I tried to build, I thought it would work for like small projects, but I just couldn't get into it. So this I guess it works for some people, but I will tend to fall back to the object-oriented style. And I personally like to keep my selectors 1 or 2 levels. It's a bit strict, but it's just to flatten out the specificity. The challenge I had with that project, the aforementioned project, it was that as the design came in, I realized that I was running out of ways to name my components. So it would be like C-booking _ something, and then there will come a new component that had something to do with booking, but it was different. And I spent most of my day doing this. And then my counterpart was like, hey, you trying to name thing, is it? I'm like, yes. But so I was working very closely with another developer, and he focused more on the JavaScript and I focused more on the CSS. So what Aysha said works perfectly is that I would tell him that if you need to target anything, I will give you a J, so I will prefix with a JS something. So to make it even more obvious when you read the code, I will follow the JS camel case style for the JS class. So it's like JS camel case style class. So then at first glance you'll realize that, oh, okay, there will be no styling associated with that particular class. It's purely used for JavaScript hooks, while all the style related ones would look like standard lowercase. So that's a technique that potentially that helps a lot. So again, I agree with what she says. It's more of like you could be very strict in follow, because some of these methodologies are very, very specific rules. But what I found is that working with, and that particular project, again, is my favorite project I talk about, but I cannot say who it is. It was quite messy in terms of management, so there were a lot of developers coming out, freelancers coming out, so there's this onboarding thing. So when we started, it was 2 developers and we knew exactly what was going on, but the moment a new guy came in, we were like, oh, Zell Liew, I need to explain so we're like,
Yes.
then there'll be times where like, can I just Bluetooth my brain, Bluetooth? No, it doesn't work. So you realize that when you're forced to actually do documentation, oh, everybody's favorite, right? Your boss will come, hey, you got document or not? This part, I need me to fix that. But it's actually, you have to, because I have since wrote off that project, and I realized that as in before we left, both of us, so the 2 of us who started the project, we are no longer on it anyway, but we left with at least his JavaScript documentation was, I don't know, you had to scroll, I think it was about 400 to 500 lines, and then I also tossed in a style guide that was quite long. So at the end of the day, my suggestion is that don't put off the documentation. So as you start, because it's actually good to think about documentation first, because then you are forced to when you realize that, oh shit, I actually have to write this down, it forces you to actually put more thought into the CSS structure rather than just ad hocing it. Because if you ad hoc it about 1 month in, when your boss turn around and say, hey, so did you got documentation on new guy coming in? Then you don't have. Oh, then Zell Liew. So that's something to keep in mind, because the documentation not only helps the new guy, it actually helps it will help yourself. So yeah, that's my thing.
I spent about 10 years in a small team looking after, I think, over 100 sites when we were finished. And because we had 2 of us looking after 100 sites CSS, we had to learn how to scale things pretty fast. So the way that we got around that was pretty much following the SMAX structure before SMAX existed. So when Jonathan Snook came along and did that, it's like, hey, he's doing what we're doing, which was pretty good. If only we'd written it up first.
Documentation.
Basically, for any given project, you'd have about 80% of the CSS common. And some of the benefits of doing that on scale is that when you find a bug in one project, you can fix it and roll it out on all of them. We had to use versioning as well, because you could potentially introduce breaking changes here and there. But that's pretty much how we did it. In terms of naming conventions, we didn't really follow any conventions per se. We tried to go semantic, because Andy Clark taught us in around 2004 that semantic HTML is a really good thing. So we tried to keep our naming quite semantic, but it was still fairly straightforward CSS per se. In the last 18 months, I've changed tack completely, and I'm now using my own custom variation of BEM, which is using the Harry Roberts style prefixes. I didn't know he'd done those either. Last. Yeah, the advantage, the reason I've gone for this is because it's not just myself and one other guy looking after the code base anymore. the advantage of having a really clear naming structure is pretty much anyone can come in and have some idea of what's going on. The thing I find most difficult is coming up with names for things. Once you know what the thing is actually for, then that's what it is in the CSS. So if it's I've got a homepage which has kind of newsy kind of things on there. So I got a journalist reference for what the names of things are inside a magazine article and poured through all of that, and all our names follow that now. Basically giving it a structure that's independent of what it's going to look like or how it's going to behave or anything like that. Once you come up with names like that, the freedom from it to code it however you like is amazing. We don't get any SAS lint complaints about the depth of anything anymore because you don't need it. Not much anyway. The risk of following something like BEM too far is that you'll have a class on everything or three. I'm quite opposed to that because I don't want to have to maintain all that code. So I still do use some nesting here and there, but cautiously because I don't want any conflicts, and I sure don't want anyone to feel like they need to write important anywhere in their code. That's pretty much what I'm doing at the moment. Zell, how many people maintain your code?
Right now it's only me. So that's a good plus. I don't have to care about what other people think.
But you've got current you and future you.
Yeah, that's
basically.
Yeah.
Because future you is looking back at past Zell.
Yeah.
And could be Shanky.
Future me will say,
yeah.
Zell, you suck. And basically that's what happened along the way. Like I didn't start with adopting the component naming conventions at the start. It was basically, but like I was basically following bootstrap style at first, and it didn't go very well for me. So classes started to clutter around, things started to go messy, and it's pretty hard to find things in CSS if you follow that kind of convention. So what happened after that? I started following BEM, trying out with BEM, and then as usual, you get the BEM naming convention. You get 3-4 layers down, and it starts to get weird. But then again, now when I use BEM, I stick to 2 layers. Even if it's a grandchildren component, it's still under the same component. So if it's, let's say, article, there's an article list or article list item. Some people will go so far and saying it article __ list __ item. I say the moment you have 2 double underscores, you generally don't want that anymore. So what I do is I will do article list, and then if I need to style the items within, I will do article list, and then in my selector I'll use the descendant selector, the list item. So I'll mix things around to make sure that both HTML and CSS look neat and tidy. So it's not that much of a problem to say, like what these guys have been saying, we don't have to follow naming conventions to the book because they are there as a guideline, and if you bring anything too far, it's going to be bad for you.
How many are you?
About 4 people maintaining my CSS right now. So yeah, that's why we need SCSS Lin and making sure that everything is, everyone's following the convention that we set. And also there's a funny story recently. I mean, Shermeen actually she actually found a bug with a Japanese text. So apparently for a typography open sans, when you bold a Japanese text, kanji text, whatever text, it's not readable. So we had to, so it was not readable because all of the strokes is really thick.
Is it a font, as in, is it because of the particular font they use, or is it just about the browser rendering?
Yeah, we need to research more into it because we just found it pretty recently.
Okay.
So when we bold, the text was not looking quite good because the stroke was too thick and you can't read it well. So what we had to do is we had to scope a class, like the strong class, the bolded class, in a language attribute, Japanese language attribute. So we do not know where to put that initially. It doesn't fit to any of our components file, definitely not helper. So we decided to create a file called shame CSS. So this is where we actually put all of our shameful stuff, and we will make sure that the shame file will have less rule as possible.
Okay, actually, I have one too, and I have a comment at the top that says items in this file cannot last longer than 1 week.
Yeah.
I have a shame file that I keep empty
That's
I've
nice.
never had
We
a
have
Chen
one
file.
item right
My Chen stuff
But
just
it's
goes
more of like a,
into
crunch time. Crunch time, I need to get this out by tomorrow, but I have no idea, my brain is not thinking, well, change. Get it up and forget about it until
Yeah.
So what you mentioned is really, so is the font does the font actually have support for East Asian languages?
I don't think so.
Because if
So,
it
yeah.
doesn't, right, it's actually not red. It's the because I use web fonts and I'm the irritating person who wants to like keep my size as small as possible. So I actually go and custom subset my fonts. So sometimes, so I basically just use the basic Latin subset because I'm writing in English.
Oh,
But sometimes I'll use words like, I don't know, Beyonce, because Beyonce has that E with that dash on top.
Yeah. Okay.
So when I try that particular letter just
It's not
doesn't come out
supported.
right because it's not in the character set of my font. So if your particular font that you are using doesn't support East Asian language, it's actually that the font will render, it may fall back to the system font, I think.
Should be the system
Yeah.
font then.
So then
or a hacked version thereof.
Yeah.
because
It's the worst.
then that particular font is not optimized for like italics or bold when you apply that. So I think that might be a problem.
If that is the problem, then what you want to do is to add the font family in front. So anything that doesn't go into the font family goes into the font text.
Because I did create Chinese sites before. So what we do for that is using web fonts for Chinese sites is a challenge because in the first place, Chinese fonts it's almost impossible to subset, and the Chinese font fonts are huge. So we'll fall back to system fonts. Some of the system fonts are pretty good, but so like what he mentioned, right? If you're doing a Chinese site or any East Asian language site, right? You want to declare the Chinese fonts first, because if you declare the Chinese fonts last, and what's going to happen is that you may have instances where your Latin fonts actually end up in it will use the Chinese font files instead of your designated Latin font files. So your text will come out looking weird. So you want to declare the East Asian languages first in your font stack.
Oh, okay. Okay, that's interesting to know. Yeah,
We
we're
could
gonna
speak about
do-
fonts for a long time.
Sorry.
We'll move on from fonts because we
Yeah,
can
but
speak
the-
about
the-
fonts.
Okay.
Oh, okay.
The topic today isn't about fonts.
Yeah.
Oh, yeah. But that's good to know.
How many of you are there waiting?
So that previous fiasco of a project, I think, has now been passed on to the 6th or 7th guy, revolving door of developers. That one was.
It's development hell basically for the person who's working on it now.
Yeah. So, but I'm now since switched jobs, so now it's just me. So basically my life is a combination of the two of their lives. Because they're like very steady. This one's forever been a freelancer working by himself. This one's like, been holding down a steady job, and I'm like, well, I don't know. My sister's like, do you still have a job? I'm like, yes, I actually do. Yes, I can pay rent this month. So I've had like my own code, and I've also had a code that had been shipped to India and back. That was fun. Really fun.
That actually reminded me that some of my code has been shipped over to the development people. Like I basically built the Talk..SG site in, if you didn't know. Then that has been passed on to the MediaCorp development guys. So I have no idea what the thing inside there is about anymore.
On that, if you have a look at Al Jazeera, they hired Mark Bolson, who's probably one of the best typography type CSS people in the world. Got him to do their entire site, make it responsive. It's brilliant. Their site is really awesome. If you go into their code, you'll see workaround to do the thing differently from what Mark told us to do, basically. Because the people who are working on it don't know how to do it as well as he did. So they've got the not Mark Bolton hacks in there.
Not Mark Bolton.
Basically.
Oh, really?
Yeah. So I'm sure if he looks at the site again,
Al
he'll probably
Jazeera.
scream. Al Jazeera.
So at this point, it goes back to what she said, or at least for those of us who work on sites where multiple people are. So the consistency issue is actually a very hard issue to solve, because programmers like have their own style. Like everybody has different handwriting, right? So how do you get everybody to just behave? Like stop doing stupid hacks, and you think that nobody will know, but come on, like. So I think it is more of a, it depends on your team, as in how strong is your team, meaning the people who, I would say the people who already exist in that team, because you are the ones who are going to build the culture of the team. And so how strong is that? How strong are you on doing on good best practice? Or are you the type that, oh, client wants it tomorrow, it's okay, fine, no pass. You know, so I think that plays a very huge part in keeping code consistent. And it's not just for CSS, I'm sure for any other language, I think there are ground rules that every team ought to have, but not every team has them. Or they have them, but they are token rules that, rules, yeah, it's here, I use it to like prop up my chair. You know that kind of thing. So I think that actually is the human factor is bigger than the actual system you're using, you know?
Yeah. I've got one last question which we'll go through fairly quickly, so I don't want to keep us too long. We've kind of covered it, but how do you deal with your shame? How do you deal with IE hacks and things like that? Do you have a separate file for them? What do you do exactly? So,
I used to have an IEX file a few years ago, but nowadays no. Because IE has already been pretty decent.
What's your IE support level?
9 and above.
So how do you work Flexbox?
Well, Flexbox you can just polyfill it.
Okay.
Right?
Yeah.
If I mean there's no harm polyfilling stuff. It's like the number of users are like so little. I had to polyfill response.js for Talk.CSS at the time, and they wanted to support IE8, for example. So there's no harm doing a polyfill if there is really a need to. Depending on, you have to take a look at who you're developing for, who are your users, take a look at the analytics and see what percentage there really is. And then if that surpasses a certain benchmark, then you start developing certain hacks for certain browsers if you need to. Otherwise, nah.
If you ever need ammo for why you don't want to support lower versions of IE, people who use those browsers have a much lower conversion rate, so they're not worth the money.
So the shame file, right?
So you've just got shame file, but you don't really have to worry about IE that much.
I don't have to worry about specific browser implementations because all the code that I write are workable across all browsers. Yeah. I think I picked that up as a habit.
CSS.
No, I picked that up as a habit since I think 1 or 2 years back. So whenever I try to write CSS code, I make sure that everything I learn works across every browser before I implement it. And that has become sort of like a habit. So I don't work with experimental properties, which is not many people agree with me. Like I haven't even worked with CSS grids, even though I play with CSS for a lot. I didn't work with Flexbox until the support got strong enough. Then I dove into Flexbox. So I don't learn experimental properties for the sake of experimenting. So I only learn them when they're stable enough, and then when they're stable enough, I make sure that they can be used across every browser then fine. And that's the general way I do things. So I never had a use for that.
My answer is pretty much the same as Zell. I think before our site becomes responsive, we do have a file for IE hacks. But now we don't really support IE much. I think baseline for our IE support is IE 10 and above. Because my product manager is a guy from Microsoft, so he told me that we shouldn't care about whatever is below. So and basically we just have the shame file for quick fixes and everything else, and of course polyfills. Polyfills saves lives. Yeah.
Same.
Yeah. So I actually use for Project X, right? Let's just call it Project X, okay?
So many secret projects.
No, just that one.
Is that one.
For Project X, right? The guys who rolled out the contract didn't specify version. So that is, you can think of it as a good thing or bad thing. So the good thing is that if the client doesn't say anything, you can get away with it because we didn't really say anything. But if they notice that it doesn't work on my BlackBerry, you're screwed, you're screwed. So that's one thing. But in general, it should. I like to say current and to behind. Yeah. So if it's current and 2 behind, like what they are doing is IE10, which is fine. But so at the time, I didn't dare use Flexbox because we may have to support older versions. One thing I realized is that Modernizer actually inserts certain classes that you can leverage on for your so-called IE hacks. So that's one way if you have to support certain features that are not backward compatible. So then you can write specific styles to, so maybe that it won't look exactly the same as your supposed layout, but it won't be broken. So that's one way to do it. As for shame, like him, I don't really, my shame file is generally empty. But what I differ from him is that I will play with experimental ones, but I will add the fallback. So yes, my code will be a bit, I have repeats. So, shameless plug, Talk.CSS has a website now.
I haven't even updated the slides for the URLs.
But, so because it's my it's like our website, so it's my personal playground to play with stuff. So I use CSS variables. When I first launched, pre-launched it, everybody told me, hey, the color broken on Survivor, siao liao. So CSS variables are only supported in 9.1. So at the time when it came out, 9.1 didn't come out yet. So what we just do is just declare one more line after the CSS variables, like just a normal color ... green. So yes, there's a duplicate there, but it's a fallback. So that's how most people coded last time. They would just fallback. That's why if you look at the older code, you'll see for example gradients or opacity is 4 lines background image, and all kinds of variations and combinations of filters and stuff. So I mean, I like to play with the experimental stuff because I think for me, I'm very interested in how W3C themselves, how the specification comes out, how it's pushed to browsers, and how it gets implemented. So basically the process, you have to have developers who are willing to play around with the experimental features and provide feedback to the spec writers so that then you can be like, okay, I've tried this and it doesn't really work, maybe you want to change it. It's like, it's actually not, you can choose to be a passive receiver of all these new technologies, or you can actually, contribute in a little way. So right now the call to developers in general is for grid, to enable the experimental flag and grid and try your best to break it. And if you find something that really doesn't make sense, you can raise bugs or raise feedback back, and that's how we can make sure that when the spec actually formally comes out, right, it really works as intended. Flexbox was a bit mishandled at the time. Yeah. So the spec writers are trying to learn from this, because right now there's 3 different syntaxes for Flexbox. Yeah. It's because that process wasn't handled very well, but W3C is trying to improve on their process, and that's why they're encouraging people to please break grid right now that it's not supported by anyone yet, so that by the time they formalize the spec and they give it to the browser vendors, here, build it this way, they are quite confident it will work right. So that's something.
I'll finish on me. I'm using Modernizer, and I basically modernize the sniff features. Flexbox, for example, since I have to support back to IE8 on one project.
No way.
I've had, in the past, I used to have the separate IE3 CSS. 4, 5, 6, 7, and
IE3. I've never heard of IE3.
In my company at the time, I was single-handedly responsible for killing it.
Did you support Netscape Navigator?
Netscape was the best.
My dad has a copy right now, really. He doesn't let me do it.
I started doing this before CSS was around.
OG.
Yeah, basically, I instead of having anything that says IE this or that, I basically sniff on the feature. So if it's no Flexbox, I'll have my no Flexbox code separate, but within the same region as the other. Yeah.
Okay.
And my styles are quite split up as well. So I've got one style just for my grid, another one just for typography. So any of those shapefile things, which is basically sniffed, sits in the same location.
Do you use SAS or just CSS?
SAS.
Oh, okay. So when you say you're actually talking about SAS files.
Yeah. But it was CSS before that. The structure hasn't really changed all that much.
Because if you use multiple CSS files, do you import them separately, or do you sort of merge them? You do the import on the main CSS itself.
I used to use a file merge utility to put them all together.
Oh, okay.
And then we ran into problems because we had Windows in some environments and not in others, and the file endings are different if you're not careful. And especially when you're merging files together, because everything doesn't look at it, it's kind of bad.
I think
Kind of big production error.
Right now the problem is should we like minify the CSS anymore?
Yes.
Because like HTML2.
Yes. To us.
I have no idea, but until that settles down, I guess.
Okay. Any questions from anybody? Anyone who's an adamant defender of atomic CSS wants to?
Yeah. It wasn't much of an argument since all of us engineers.
Yeah.
Okay. We need a more controversial topic next
Next
time.
up, like, what's the kind of CSS you should be ashamed about?
Important.
Not necessarily.
One of the things.
Well, you generally don't want the important things, but sometimes you need to. Once in a while.
Yeah, once in a while.
Like if you take a look at Suite CSS, there's this portion where it's like a line left, a line right, a line center, that kind of thing. And it's basically hacks for specific elements that developers don't want to think about in just one class. Then you have to import them because generally those classes will be just one class, and then they need to be of super specificity. But if you do the whole CSS file from scratch or something like along that line, then you probably don't need that kind of thing if you plan it properly.
But you'll get a deadline sooner or later, so you'll get something that just doesn't make sense to you on that day.
Yeah.
So you have to deploy on the afternoon. You've got the bug. You don't know why it doesn't want to work right now in Safari for what's the last macOS 10.10. I have a specific bug in mind where I ran into this. Had to deploy, so I just did whatever I could to get the thing actually working. That what I did and what every good developer should also do is make sure you comment it like there's no tomorrow. So you basically write this massive stream of comments for your one line in there saying, I know this is wrong. I know that anyone who looks at this later on is going to say, what were you thinking? But this is my rationale behind it. At least then you can pat yourself on the shoulder.
So let me give you another example where I use important. I really used important in review.js. So if you use review.js as your HTML slides before, you kind of know that the styles will be .review something, .review something, .review something. So everything you have to say .review something, and then after a while it starts to get irritating. So I do whatever styles that is only used like once. I know it's only used once, and I know where it's going to use it. Important, forget it. So I reduced the development overhead by importing things away that I could get away with because, well, this is going to be a one-off project. Things like that.
Any other questions? Yeah.
We talk a lot about keeping CSS clean and namespacing and stuff like that. But I think like one of the things that I try to keep in mind is the fact that your HTML really also affects the way your CSS behaves. So if something you really clean HTML will result in much cleaner CSS than you just like loose nested divs. So like how do you guys work with that? Like, how do you make sure that HTML is really succinct and just like have convenience everywhere?
Can I take that, having been around too long? In the early 2000s, the solution to that, CSS came along and everyone just put whatever in there. So the early 2000s, the idea of actually returning to the semantic roots of HTML came into being. And it was really making sure that don't use a div or a span because you can't work out what the actual tag should be. Read what a UL is actually capable of doing and that kind of thing. For example, for my grids, I'm using ULs because it's a list of objects. That doesn't really make much semantic sense outside of that, so I don't really use it in my CSS. But then your CSS classes should actually, like if you read the name of the class, you should be able to know what it is without having to have a look at it. So semantics keep both things in check reasonably well. Where it goes crazy is with things like atomic CSS, where it pretends that CSS is in its own isolated little thing and nothing else exists. There are similar attempts to inject the CSS straight into the inline CSS. So basically you have your back-end language which generates the entire front end because the person doesn't know how to write CSS properly. and you got no semantic anything going on there. But yeah, when we're talking clean code, it's the ideal is to have your HTML, your CSS, and JavaScript in harmony with each other. If one of them's starting to dominate the others, then maybe things are a little bit wrong. But that's where naming conventions are really useful, just having that structure in each environment. So your HTML should be structured, you should know what the syntax is going to be. But as should your CSS, as should your JavaScript. And you probably have different people working on each, but just talk, really. Make sure you're all happy.
I have a sweeping statement. Don't use Bootstrap.
Yes.
Yes.
But I understand where you're coming from, because I used to build Drupal sites, and Drupal by default will because it's a CMS, so it generates the markup, and if you use lots of modules, you'll nest it to the 18th level of hell and back. So what some people
and I
have.
use the style for her book.
Yeah, she used to style for me. Yeah, that's how we know each other, by the way. So what people do, I think it's generally widely accepted that you don't want to nest very deep. So if you can have more control over your HTML, you are very right in that. Your HTML has to be, you have to have control over your HTML in order to do a lot of the things that we said. And if you can't, sometimes as he would attest to this, and myself, because I used to team for Drupal also, sometimes you can't get around it. You will end up having selectors that look ridiculous, that are wrapped around the second line. But I think to a certain extent, it's about balancing ideals and practical deliverables, because done is better than perfect. Because I used to work in an agency setting, right? Is you have to deliver, you have to ship. The client's not going to wait for you to get your code right. So but you also don't want to go overboard to like, okay, I think it won't topple over now. That also doesn't work. So I think it's a balance that comes with experience. I think there's no substitute for experience. So if anybody is like just starting out and you don't know what's going on, right? I say don't be so hard on yourself, because the only way that you can get better is really to experience it. You can know what's the correct way to do things, but until you are in a live production, in a situation where you have to deliver something real, right? It doesn't feel the same. Like right now, cause like okay, I cycle everywhere. I can tell you the bicycle route from here to my house, but until you yourself actually take that route, you won't know a lot of little things that I know, because I've experienced the route. You won't know that, oh, this traffic light, I better speed up, because if I miss it, I'm going to be stuck here for 3 minutes. You won't know that, oh, after this bus stop, right, there's a huge pothole and I need to siam. These are the things I call experience, and these are the things that you really need actual experience delivering projects to actually know. So if you feel like, hey, I don't know a lot of things, actually it's not, you're not expected to know. Like I feel that some people are like, oh, everything new coming up, I cannot catch up. I said it doesn't matter, because I think it's good to like know, like you hear, oh, I think this new thing came out recently. You don't have to clamor to learn it immediately. If you need it, then you learn it, and then you remember that forever. Rather than you just everything touch and go and you don't actually use it. If you don't actually use it, there's no point. Like as what Sahil said, life very short. You know, life is too short.
Life is too short to learn everything.
And I think what we need to do. Everybody doesn't have enough time. Nobody has enough time anymore. So I think it's important to really pick and choose what you need to know. Then try to chase everything.
Yeah.
Because our industry moves way too fast.
I think if you want to talk about keeping your HTML as neat as possible, as clean as possible, then as much as possible you try to write the HTML. Because as you try to write the HTML, you start to look at how divs get grouped together. You start to realize, hey, actually you can group these 4 things into one div rather than having it into 2 rows, for example, like Bootstrap style. Like maybe let's say a 5-item grid with 2 features and 3 grid items below, and then there's a pattern. You can do it with 1 div instead of having it as 2 separate divs. Then as you go along, you try to write your HTML, try to compact things and nest things together, and then you learn along the way. So I think that's the best way to learn. So like what Jing said, don't beat yourself up too hard if you don't seem to get it. we all have been on that path. We have been beating ourselves for a while, I think, and you just get things over time. And after a while, you start to realize that hey, this thing doesn't make sense, and then you start to tweak around. Trust your own gut, trust your own brain, because we are all smart people. And if something doesn't feel right to you, then use your discretion to start changing it. Maybe you can come up with something that even the top gurus out there haven't thought of. It might just be that case.
Okay. Any other questions? Anyone? No? Thank you, Zell.
Okay, as the organizer, I want to say thank you everybody for showing up. Like, even though we always very haphazard, like every time you come, there's a technical difficulty. If any of you came for the last one, you'll be like, oh, so got everyday technical difficulty, what are these guys doing? So, I mean, you could be anywhere else right now, but you chose to spend your time here with us. So, thank you very much for coming, everybody.
Thank you.